I think that campsite selection is the most important skill that I've ever learned in regards to hiking and backpacking. And that is because a good campsite is going to be warmer, it's going to be devoid of bugs, it's going to be more comfortable, it's going to be safer, and it's going to be more protected than a bad campsite. This is a bad campsite, by the way, and we'll get into that in a minute here. Now, you could just carry more gear and more gear and more weight to achieve all those same things, the extra warmth, the lack of bugs, the extra comfort. But what if you could leave that extra gear and that extra weight at home and still have those same things? So campsite selection is a really great example of trading weight and extra gear for just a simple skill or technique. So in other words, the more ultralight you want to go, the more campsite selection is going to be of value to you. But even if you are carrying the extra weight, this will still be of benefit to you because again, this will allow you to be even more comfortable, even warmer, even safer, regardless of the gear. So then, what makes a good campsite anyway? So one of the first things that I look for on pretty much every night that I'm ever going to camp, this is the one big thing, is I want some kind of trees or cover above me. It doesn't have to be trees, it can be a large overhanging bush, but I want some kind of natural cover. And that's one of the reasons that this is a bad campsite. So having trees above you, one of the big benefits of that is it actually will create a microclimate in between you and the canopy of trees above you. So by camping underneath some trees, it's actually going to be warmer. So on that cold night, don't set it up out in a big field like this. It's gonna be a lot colder. Find some trees and set it up underneath those. Now the other thing that microclimate does is it helps to prevent condensation. So if I'm camping in an open field like this, I'm almost certainly going to wake up and my tent is just going to be covered in dew. So if you've been having trouble with condensation or dew on top of your shelter in the morning, then find some tree cover, find a big bush and set it up underneath them. Camping underneath some kind of canopy, some kind of bush, some kind of tree, whatever it is something that I'm looking for pretty much every single night. It's going to be warmer, I'm not going to have to deal with condensation, and it's going to be better if a storm just rolls in. Now, number two, this isn't something that I will do every night. It's kind of condition dependent, but if it's going to be really windy, I'm going to want some natural cover from the wind. So again, out in a field like this, you see here, it's going to get very windy here tonight, which may make it hard for me to even set up my tent in the first place, or while I'm camping in the night, my tent stakes may get pulled out and I'm gonna have to wake up, get up, my tent's gonna be collapsed on top of me, and I'm gonna have to be fiddling with my tent stakes in the middle of the night to try and get them back in. So heavy wind, no good. If it's going to be windy, I will look for natural cover. Some thick trees around you can do this, some thick brush, or searching for camp spots that are near rock outcroppings is something I will very, very frequently look for. So a campsite that is more protected from the wind. Now, if you're camping in a windy spot, it's also going to be colder. So if a cold front is coming in, I don't want to add wind on top of that. So I will look for that naturally sheltered location to keep myself a little bit warmer at night. So camping in windy spots can be really, really not fun, especially if you're adding wind on top of some kind of storm, whether that's rain or whether that's a cold front. It can be very, very bad. Now, the reason I don't do this every night is, well, there's not always wind around, but also wind can be your friend, and sometimes you actually do want it. A great example of a time where I would purposefully pick a breezy location to camp in is if there's a lot of mosquitoes around. If I'm camping in Oregon on the PCT, I may specifically seek out a spot that has a nice breeze or a nice wind rolling through to hopefully help blow away those bugs. So if you're camping in a buggy area, sometimes taking the wind is much more preferable than taking the bugs. So another great example of how just choosing a campsite wisely can really benefit you in a lot of different ways. So one thing I see people doing all the time that is potentially negatively impacting their camping trip is camping by water. And that's lakes, rivers, streams, or even just small springs trickling out of the mountain. A lot of times you don't want to camp by those. Obviously, camping by water has a lot of benefits as well. I mean, first, it's going to be beautiful. If you're camping alongside of a lake, that's a really, really beautiful spot. So I can see why people would want that. It's also going to make making your dinner a lot easier. You'll have water for the night. You'll have water for the next morning before you leave. There's certainly a lot of benefits to camping near water. So the first big reason why you don't want to camp near water is animals. You are not the only thing that enjoys coming to water in the evening and the night and the morning. There are a lot of animals that also like to come to these water sources. So to begin with, you shouldn't be camping within like 200 feet of a water source to begin with, because you're potentially getting in the way of the natural path of the animals that are also trying to get to that water. So that's no good for the animals that live out there themselves. They take precedent over us, the visitor. But also, if you're camping close to a water source, you may find yourself having some trouble with these animals. Because they're just coming there as they do naturally, normally, every day, every other day, whatever. And now they're stumbling across you in the night and potentially your food bag. So if you're camping at water sources, you have a much, much higher potential of having to deal with animals in the night. So it's generally something I'm gonna try and avoid by not sleeping near water sources. Now, another thing you should be aware of when you're camping near a lake or a river or something is it's gonna be colder. Generally, these water sources are at lower elevations, and that is where cold air is going to sink in the night. So if you're camped near a lake or a river, it's gonna be way colder than if you're camped a quarter of a mile, a half a mile away from it. So again, maybe you have the gear to facilitate that. Maybe you're gonna be warm either way, but maybe a cold front is coming in and it's just going to be compounded again by camping by that water source. And that's maybe not what you want. Now, the third big thing when it comes to camping near water is that there's gonna be more bugs. Bugs breed, they live, and they hang out near water sources. So camping near a lake, you're gonna find way more mosquitoes, way more black flies, way more gnats than you're gonna find if you had just moved on another half mile, 2 miles, whatever. So lakes, rivers, whatever it may be, it's going to be colder. There's a higher potential for having to deal with animals, and there's more bugs. So the vast majority of the time, I will just grab my water in the evening and I will hike on. You don't want to camp in valleys, maybe. Don't want to camp at water sources. Well, what about the tops of mountains? Do you want to camp on the very peak of a mountain or higher up in elevation? Generally, I want to find a spot that's like right in the middle. I don't want to go to the very top. You're going to be so much more exposed to the elements. If a storm comes in, you are going to be taking the worst of it because you are at the very peak. If it's windy, it is going to be way more windy at the very tops of mountains. It's going to be colder at the highest of elevations. So with these two tips in mind, avoiding camping in the valleys at the lowest of elevation and avoiding camping at the tops of peaks at the higher elevations, I want to find somewhere right in the middle. I think right in the middle, you're going to have that nice sweet spot where it's not going to be as cold, you're not going to be as exposed, there's not going to be as many bugs. So instead of the valleys, instead of the peaks, I'll just try and find something that's right in the middle. So something you've probably noticed at this point is the best campsite is often not the most beautiful campsite. Do what makes you happy. Just be aware, depending on the conditions you're facing, how these different campsites may affect you positively or negatively for those conditions. If the weather is great, then absolutely camp on top of that mountain, camp next to that lake, But if the weather's not forecasted to be so good, maybe consider avoiding these spots. Now, my next tip for campsite selection is not something you can do in every location, but something that I will try and do every time that I can. And that is to avoid popular campsites, or avoiding very well established campsites, very well used campsites. You can't do this everywhere. Think national parks, state parks. A lot of land managers don't want you to camp in locations that aren't established. So a lot of places there's rules and regulations, and you should follow those. I follow those, and you should follow those. Now, one of the reasons I avoid these spots is something we've already talked about, and that is animals. Animals have grown extremely accustomed to finding food at a campsite that's had 100, 200, 1,000 people sleep there before. So animals have grown accustomed to finding food there, and a lot of times what you find is rodents or bears that will just be making their rounds from established spot to established spot to established spot to see if they can find food there, because they've found food there however many times in the past. So you may not have trouble with bears, but you're almost certainly going to have trouble with rodents when you are camping at popular campsites, because these rodents, they've set up shop. They've made a home out of these popular campsites because they know that hikers drop crumbs, that hikers are messy, and that's just not something I want. So I will avoid popular campsites. But there's other reasons as well why I like to avoid those. One of those is that these spots are just heavily worn in. You know, you're going to be sleeping on hard, compact ground. There is no longer nice, natural, like grass or leaves or pine needles there. So a lot of times these campsites are just not going to be comfortable at all. The third reason I avoid these is because over time, after hundreds of people have slept in the same spot, it's no longer going to be flat. It's going to be slightly dished, because you've had people stepping there over and over and over, setting up their tents, taking down their tents, sleeping there, and creating this dished spot. So if it is going to rain at night, what is going to happen with all that water? It is just going to pool underneath your tent, and you're going to be sleeping in a waterbed. So in general, I just like to avoid these camp spots entirely. So this next tip is very, very much so related, and that's, I look for spots that have a nice natural ground cover. And that could be grass, that could be pine needles, that could be a nice bed of leaves. One thing you do have to really be careful of is you don't want to camp on stuff that you're going to be harming. So generally, pine needles or dead leaves is what I'm looking for. So the big benefit of sleeping on a nice bed of leaves or pine needles or whatever it may be is that it's going to be a lot more comfortable. You know, if you're using a foam mat especially, then sometimes this is really going to be like a make or break kind of situation for comfort. So that's something I definitely like looking for when I can. Now, my next tip is one that I think is really, really important, and something you're gonna find on pretty much every trail you ever do. And that is to avoid camping near roads, or avoid campsites that are within close proximity to a road. Now, why do you wanna do this? Well, that's because locals sometimes can be really cool, but sometimes locals can be not so cool. I always think to myself that bad people are generally pretty lazy. You know, so if you're camped near a road, you know, that's just like a really easy opportunity for a bad person to maybe take advantage of. Maybe someone who doesn't really intend to go out there to camp is probably not gonna go that much further than a mile or 2 miles from a road. So a campsite that is close to a road is something that I will generally try and avoid. Now, my last tip is an easy one. Always look up. Look up at the trees above you and ask yourself, if a big storm is coming through, if a big gust of wind is going to blow through, are those trees safe? Or are those trees potentially at risk of falling on top of you? So always look up and ask yourself if the trees above you look safe. Now anyway, I'll say it again, do what makes you happy, do what you enjoy. You know, a lot of people are out there for those most beautiful campsites, you know, and if that's going to make you the happiest, then you should absolutely sleep next to that lake, sleep on top of that mountain. But just be aware that some of these places are going to be colder, there's gonna be more bugs, you know, and maybe technically they aren't the best campsite. So when the conditions call for it, sometimes you may need to choose that not so pretty campsite, but that technically better campsite. So I hope you found this video valuable. If you did, give me a little thumbs up. If you want to see more stuff like this, then please subscribe to this channel. I hope you enjoyed, and I will catch you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching.